Well, it's my great pleasure today to introduce my dear personal friend, Joseph Milne, who will be speaking on Kathleen Raine and tradition. I met Joseph, a very personal note to begin with. Excuse me. I met Joseph at my last year at university at Kent, and so that goes back quite a bit. At the time he was studying theology, and although he originally studied music, Joseph being composer, he found himself at Kent, the religious studies department. I am personally greatly indebted to Joseph for many things, and it was, moreover, Joseph who first introduced me to the work of Kathleen Raine. And I remember him saying in our student days that I really had to read her collection of essays called Defending Ancient Springs, and in particular on the use of the beautiful. And I can honestly say that that essay was a complete turning point in my life. For Joseph then, he taught for many years afterwards on the renowned MA in the study of religion and mystical experience, again at the University of Kent, and now gives much of his time to the Temenos Academy, notably his wonderful weekly Shakespeare seminar in London. And he also gives his time to the Eckhart Society and the Henry George Foundation through his interest in economics. He's currently writing a book on natural law, and so considering all these things, I think we can say that there's more than one string to Joseph's bow. And it's without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Joseph for his talk on Kathleen Raine. Thank you very much, Joseph.
Short person. Can you hear me? Yes. Closer? Right. Well, thank you, Andrew, for a lovely introduction. Andrew and I were very old friends. We've got to the stage where we can insult each other very happily. So I would like to say that I'm greatly honoured to be invited to speak in homage to Kathleen Raine. I would like to thank the organisers of the conference for all their work, which I know was enormous. So my theme is Kathleen Raine's place in tradition and a concern for the lost vision of the poets in our time. But first, I would like to tell you how I came to meet Kathleen back in 1989. I was studying theology and made friends with a student studying English literature. I suggested he read Kathleen Raine's poetry. Meanwhile, I showed him an essay I had written on Macbeth. He was enchanted by Kathleen's poetry and wrote her a letter, and without telling me, included my essay on Macbeth, which I had no right to write on whatsoever because I'm not a literary scholar. Kathleen replied, invited us both to afternoon tea at her home in London. This was the first of many most enjoyable visits. At that time, Kathleen was very keen to set up the Temenos Academy. She was preparing Temenos 12, the original journal, and insisted on including my essay on Macbeth, which I had no right to write. After subjecting it to some very brutal editing. That is an experience in itself to be edited by Kathleen. She then asked me to review Ted Hughes' The Goddess of Complete Being for Temenos 13. Meanwhile, the Temenos Academy was founded and Kathleen invited me to give a talk on Shakespeare's Hamlet. So I found myself writing and lecturing on Shakespeare while literature was not my field, and still is not my field. So I have no right to speak on it at all. However, I did not enjoy this for very long before being challenged by Martin Lings, who wrote a very long letter of 32 pages, fiercely critiquing my interpretation of Hamlet, to which I wrote a 32-page response. He copied his letter to Kathleen, and Kathleen insisted on seeing my reply to Martin Lings. Kathleen took my side and wanted to find a way of publishing our dispute over Hamlet. Not as mischievous as Kathleen, I was unwilling to do that. I have a general principle only to write and publish affirmatively and not engage in disputations, but privately I will engage in disputations. Meanwhile, Kathleen took my Hamlet essay with her to India and got it published in the Indian journal called Hamlet Studies. So this I give as an example of Kathleen's enormous kindness to me. Once the Temenos Academy was founded, and His Royal Highness had given us a meeting rooms in his new Institute of Architecture, Kathleen asked me to take Shakespeare seminars, beginning with Hamlet. I remember the first seminar very vividly. As we gathered, I noticed that Kathleen had no copy of the play. I asked her, "Where is your copy?" She replied, "I do not need a copy." And indeed she did not. She knew Shakespeare and almost all the great poets practically off by heart, and I think most of the New Testament as well. Yet she put me in charge of the seminar. Now, 30 years later, I'm still giving those Shakespeare seminars at Temenos Academy. I did wonder why Kathleen was so keen on me teaching Shakespeare. I was working on my very boring PhD in theological anthropology and had no right to be teaching Shakespeare. I said to Kathleen one day, "I do not really know what I'm doing." To which she replied, "But I know what you're doing." So that was that. That was very typical of Kathleen. This is how I came to know Kathleen and how I've been working with the Temenos Academy ever since. There is, of course, a reason why Kathleen commanded me, and I use that word, commanded me, to take Shakespeare seminars. A reason which only gradually dawned on me. In my simple way, I was open to the essence of Shakespeare. That is to say, I just knew his work was the real thing, and that it came from where true art originates. This I knew from the sound of the words. The reason I studied theology was because my original intention was to set sacred text to music. I had studied composition and felt that studying sacred texts would illuminate how they ought to be set to music. This meant, when read the Bible or any sacred text as sounds, wait for that. This meant when read the Bible or any sacred text as sounds, as songs from God or songs to God. My love of music had trained my ear to recognize genuine poetry, poetry that sings. If I read a new poet if I read a new poet, the first thing I sense is whether it has music or not. Is it a song of the soul? And Shakespeare's plays come from a primordial grasp of the human soul and the cosmos. I've always been puzzled why so many read poetry as images. Words can certainly create images, but images cannot create words. Images cannot create music either. The word, the logos, is first, and speech is what makes us human beings, as Plato and Aristotle affirm. In her essay, The Use of the Beautiful, Kathleen wonders why so much of modern poetry is merely descriptive. We seem to live in a time of we seem to live in a factual age. Meaning, beauty, and a sense of the whole are missing in much modern poetry. Indeed, in much modern art. Kathleen suggests, without any compromise, that these poets and artists do not know what they're doing. I recall her saying that art used for social comment is propaganda and not art at all. She's very fierce on these things. So we live in an age in which the arts have forgotten their ground. I'm saying that's Kathleen's view, and that's my view too. This raises a very important question for our times. Kathleen became a bit of a warrior over it. When she published her great study of William Blake, she was expecting acclamation from the literary world. Instead, her work was dismissed. It was at that moment, so she told me, that she knew she had a fight on her hands and that she was going to enjoy it. She found allies with the traditionalists who liked to pummel modernity. For my part, protest against modernity is not the same as recovering the lost vision that has nurtured all that is fine in civilization. Of course, Kathleen was a woman, and maybe the gods made special allowance for her being a defender of tradition. Indeed, she admitted that being a woman was a huge advantage. And I'm sure she was right. But her real work was to affirm the underlying mystery that is present always and in everything. It is not that the light has gone out in our age, but rather that we do not open our eyes to it. When the medieval mystics saw the great mystery, they saw it in the present, not as something transmitted from the past. We have to be careful. The word modernity is a definition a materialist age gives itself, grounded in a false notion of progressive history, in mechanical time. But real time is sacred time. This is the time the poets and mystics receive their visions from. When we read Shakespeare attentively, for example, we can hear that the words come from the eternal source of language. For 20 years, I taught on the master's course in mysticism and religious experience at the University of Kent. This course explored texts from all the great religious traditions. But students almost always found difficulty with Christianity. On several occasions, I was asked please could we not use the word God? That threw me the first time, but soon I realised that the problem was not with the word God, but with an incapacity to hear the word. Our age cannot listen. It is an extraordinary thing that we have, for the first time in recorded history, all the great texts of the religions and philosophy available in English, and probably French too. And yet, many simply cannot hear them. Just to qualify that a little, something of the Eastern religions does touch many. And Kathleen had a special empathy with Hinduism. But if we cannot hear the song of nature, how can we hear the texts that celebrate it? The poets are forgetting to keep guard over the word hoard. The composers are forgetting the root of music is in hymns to the gods. But if one does not know the word hoard is there, or that the gods are there, or that nature is singing the name of God, how will one recognise what the great texts bear testimony to? I think, however, we must make special allowance for the poets. Hesiod proclaimed the great neglect of deity, or justice, in his days, and out of that arose Athenian democracy, and Solon, the great lawgiver. Along with the beautiful Psalms of David, there are the fierce retributive voices of the prophets. But in either case, it was the divine speaking through them. I feel we should allow that the gods or the Creator may reprimand society. But it is not ours to judge. Rather than critique our times, it would, I feel, be wiser to see them as Plato did, as ailing in the soul. The philosopher is called to be a physician of the soul and bring medicine rather than retribution. As Kathleen points out, our age has many material things previous ages lacked. But she says we are in general a less happy age. One of the causes of our modern plight is that we have spent several centuries trying to invent ourselves through mastery over nature. This is the great illusion of the reformers. What is actually required is an obedience to the great order, a recognition of the providential rule of the universe, not remaking it. Let me give an example from Shakespeare, which I think is wholly in agreement with Kathleen. Each of Shakespeare's plays are set in a world or cosmos where all human actions and commitments have their lawful consequences. Abdicate your duty as a king, and havoc and division will unfold throughout the kingdom, as we see in King Lear. This strange, gripping play would not allow us to condemn Lear, despite what he's done wrong. He has made a terrible misjudgment and suffers what must befall from it. Yet Cordelia, though banished by him, says to him at the last, no cause, absolute forgiveness. The great law in Shakespeare's dramas is regenerative love and mercy. It is at once in the cosmos and within the human heart. It is the law that joins human nature with the cosmic order. There is a correspondence between them. So that is a glimpse of the order of things that poetic vision beholds, and which moves us to compassion. Shakespeare's plays are powerful because they each set in a threefold cosmos of heaven, earth, and an underworld. That way of seeing the world is most ancient, present in the oldest myths and symbols of the universe. This, I suggest, is the whole which Kathleen Raine says is missing in the vision of many modern poets. They do not see, they do not see the universe as the true poets always see it. They do not experience themselves as situated in a cosmic whole. Yet that threefold cosmology held Christian civilization together up to the 17th century, recognised and experienced by all, by the illiterate peasant and the subtle scholar alike. It is present in the folk tales. Nobody said, please, can we not use the word God? Rather, all recognise the divinity or the divine mystery everywhere in 1,000 different names. If we go back to the moment when Kathleen's work on Blake was rejected, I believe what surprised Kathleen was that there was no community of common understanding, at least in academia. It is in this lack of community that many feel an alienation in our age. The vision of the whole, the eternal mystery present everywhere, is what speech was given to man to bear witness to. No community arises from mere self-expression, nor is it therapeutic, Kathleen Raine observes. It was in response to this alienation of our time that Kathleen founded the Temenos Academy. Here was a home for those who knew something vital was missing in our culture, where the arts, philosophy, and the great religions could all be learned from and not merely about, as in our modern universities, or most of them. There is a lesson here. It has often struck me that the lost vision of nature could begin to be recovered if everyone learned to do just one thing really well. The disconnection with nature, which Kathleen blames on quantification, has made us careless of doing things finely. Work in general has lost its dignity because it is not grounded in seeking excellence. Temenos has maintained high standards in the design and production of books. Here great credit must go to Brian Keeble and the Golgonoosa Press. If something is done well, it bears a light which nourishes the soul. If we look at old craftsmanship, we notice beautiful ornamentation, even in the simplest implements. Work at its highest can be a form of prayer or contemplation. Ornamentation is acknowledgement of God's hand in all craftsmanship. It transforms a tool into a sacrament. It's real economics. In her essay on John Donne, Kathleen remarks how there was no perspective in medieval painting. Perspective in Baroque painting puts a distance between the earth and the sacred, or earth and the heavens, while medieval painting held them together. Perspective embodies the dualism that came with the rise of the mechanical sciences. In the poetry of Donne, she observes, life is torn between two irreconcilable visions of reality, the providential universe of Christianity and the mechanical universe of Bacon and Newton. This raises the question of the meaning of and symbolism of the Bible. Miraculously translated into English at the time of Shakespeare. The early church interpretation of the Bible is really worth studying. So if you're looking for a project, I'll give you one. But first, I must tell you a story. In one of our afternoon meetings with Kathleen, we were discussing Swedenborg. As we know, William Blake was a friend of Swedenborg, and Kathleen read Swedenborg commentary on Genesis as part of her Blake researches. I too have been drawn to Swedenborg's huge commentary on Genesis some years before. I think it's 13 volumes. In this commentary, Swedenborg interprets a few verses very closely, word by word, and then presents a vision that the angels had given him. As we were discussing this work, it gradually emerged that we had read Swedenborg differently. I read his close interpretation of each word in Genesis and then skipped over the visions, while Kathleen had read his visions and skipped over his interpretation of Genesis. Suddenly, it became clear to me how I, as a mere theologian, and Kathleen, as an inspired poet, approach such texts. But to return to how the early church and the medieval monks interpreted the Bible, the first thing one finds is that the Bible revealed nature. The early church fathers were very learned in Greek philosophy and the metaphysical view of the world of the Middle Platonists, and in particular Plotinus. But when they encountered the Bible, all that abstract description of reality fell away, and nature suddenly became directly revelatory. Nature manifested the divine wisdom everywhere, in every creature, and in the providential care for mankind. Here is an example from Tertullian in the 2nd century, a little short quote. I do not believe anyone would find it frivolous if he reflects on the majesty of nature, which is regarded as the wellspring of the soul. As much as you attribute to the teacher, so much you will concede to the pupil. The teacher is nature, and the pupil is the soul. Whatever the teacher has conveyed or the pupil has learned has been communicated by God, who is the teacher of nature. Whatever the soul can surmise about its original teacher, this power resides in you, that you may reflect upon that which is in you. Be aware of that which has given you awareness. That's the end of quote. Fascinating quotation. So we notice Tertullian says, the teacher is nature and the pupil is the soul. And this is parallel with God being the teacher of nature. Tertullian then gives the salutary instruction, be aware of that which has given you awareness. An extraordinary saying. It is through nature that we have the gift of awareness. We are not objective spectators standing outside nature, but rather we are given our awareness by nature, so that God may be known in nature's wisdom. Tertullian is the father of Latin theology, yet the same understanding is present in the Greek fathers. Nature, they say, is not known through the explanations of the philosophers, even if they are true, but rather through being instructed by her. The human soul is the pupil or disciple of nature, and nature herself is taught directly by God. This way of learning directly from nature was revealed to them by the scriptures. There are countless records of their vision being transformed by scripture. Suddenly, the divine logos is present everywhere. The symbolic vision of the scriptures exceeded for them the metaphysics of the philosophers. So, the philosophers get put in their place. It was through this transformative power of scripture that the monastic tradition arose. The contemplation of scripture does not treat language as merely descriptive in our modern sense, the sense that modern poetry slips into, as Kathleen says. In Hugh of St. Victor, for example, we find that human words may have several meanings, while the words of God have infinite meanings. These words of God are not the words of the Bible as such, but the mountains and rivers, the stars and the trees, the birds, the seas and so forth, that the written words name. These things are themselves the words of God. They are God's speech, as distinct from human speech. They instruct the soul. It is the creation itself that speaks the scriptures. This is what is meant by them being inspired. Kathleen observes the same in her essay, Shelley as Mythological Poet, where she says, symbolic images are not arbitrary signs. Light and darkness, sun and moon, wind and cloud, mountain peaks and underground caverns, dove and swan and albatross, all these correspond in nature. So all these correspond in the nature of things to the meanings from time immemorial associated with them. So it's an eternal language, the language of nature. In The Land Unknown, speaking of her early experience, Kathleen writes, the soul, so I believed, has its innate form, which must unfold according to its own mysterious inner laws, as in nature, plant or animal forms. To interfere by the imposition of external constraints with this organic unfolding was the great sin against life. And the only discipline I could recognise was the necessity of attending scrupulously to the voices of intuition which guide each aright. So, end of quote. So here is nature as teacher, which Kathleen calls voices of intuition. In the High Middle Ages, language began to lose its ground in the soul, and words no longer said things, but rather stood for things. That's an important shift. Our modern conception of language holds that it represents ideas, is signs for things, or is an instrument for communication. But when Adam was brought before all the creatures to name them, he heard their names directly from them. Nature speaks, and as in the fairy tales, creatures might give you their real names if you come into a right relationship with them, but not otherwise. With this shift in our grounding in language, the meaning of allegory also changed. The allegorical sense of the Bible is what things mean. The meaning of a tree, of a mountain, or a stone. Or the allegorical meaning is the inner sense contained in the outer sense or literal sense. So, just as the cosmos was grasped as a threefold hierarchy, so were the senses of Scripture. The literal sense was the outer manifestation, the allegorical sense was the meaning within the manifestation, while the mystical sense was communion with the Logos. It is the hierarchy of senses descending from the eternal. For the monks of the 12th century, this hierarchical descent signified the incarnation. Seen in its true mystical sense, the world is the realm of the incarnation of the Logos. The Logos is present everywhere. But this knowledge of the threefold sense of Scripture and of nature was lost. An allegory came to be understood crudely as one thing standing for another. And this is how modern literary theory often treats allegory. It no longer even indicates a higher or inner meaning, but merely another sense on the same level. For example, the critics suggested that Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings was an allegory of the First World War, or of his colleagues at Oxford. While C.S. Lewis pointed out, this is not an allegory at all. But we know that Tolkien got his story from hearing the ancient names of places and things. There's a whole study of the philological knowledge behind Lord of the Rings. So abstract words have replaced concrete names, which only have meaning in the mind, not in the world. The loss of perception of the sacred brings loss of perception of the material. Matter itself is no longer seen as the great mother of all living things. We are, so to speak, no longer aware of that which has given us awareness. With the loss of the sense of both the material and the sacred, there is a loss of the inner life of the soul. The outer cosmos, according to Plato, corresponds with the inner cosmos of the soul. The life and harmony of the heavens impart life and harmony to the soul. The soul is meant to live in harmony with the heavens. Here is a theme that constantly runs through the plays of Shakespeare, not as a theory, but as dramatically manifest in the destinies of the protagonists. They are always situated in a living cosmos which embodies in itself the lawful unfolding of events. These are what Kathleen calls the correspondences of the language of the soul. Calls the correspondences or the language of the soul. For Shakespeare, the great powers and presences of nature are the vocabulary of the cosmos and the soul. The soul knows itself through the divine order of the universe. We're coming towards the end, so. Kathleen says that the poets Blake and Shelley, seeing that Christianity has degenerated into barbaric morality, turn to the Platonic tradition for inspiration. Kathleen read Thomas Taylor, as I mentioned earlier, translations of Plato and Plotinus, as Blake had done. Kathleen is rather fierce on Christianity, seeing with Blake and Shelley that the moral lawgiver of the Bible was a tyrannous illusion. Unquote. I don't say that, but Kathleen says that. Even with the metaphysical poets, as Kathleen shows in her essay on John Donne, there is an irreconcilable rift between the divine providential order and the new mechanistic material order. The Christian theophanic vision of the world was already all but lost. Yet, mark this right, it was Luther who gave deism to the materialists. Theology had already lost its spiritual ground before the rise of the new scientists. So you must blame the theologians before you blame the scientists. Nothing shows this more dramatically than the contrast between the sublime sacred music of the medieval cathedrals and the agonised, earthbound church music of today. Modern Christian art, in general, no longer aspires to heaven. So Kathleen had little patience for Christianity. Instead, she looked to the Eastern religions of Buddhism and especially Advaita Vedanta in Hinduism. She was extremely proud to be made an honorary Indian. As for many, the East tradition breathed a spiritual life which had vanished from the West. I too had looked to the Vedantic tradition and found great riches there. Yet I also found it opened my eyes to the inner life of our own tradition, as it once shone in medieval times. A glance at the Book of Kells shows how the sacred words of Scripture once embraced the creatures of nature in a mystical unity. Calligraphy was then a mode of prayer or contemplation. Really, it is this contemplative life that has been lost in the West, whether in contemplation of nature or of Scripture. We have lost the art of waiting to be shown the mystery. Or in Kathleen's words, in that wondrous pattern, she says, the order of which the arts have in the past been the expression does not cease to exist because it is no longer perceived. But the arts, as these are practiced and understood in the newly illiterate but still barbarous population, are no longer its vehicle. But Kathleen also says on the previous page, yet no act of protest or reiteration of the predicament as such can give any release, for it does not provide the cure, but only describes the disease. Did not Dostoevsky say that our salvation can only be through the beautiful? This reminds us that Kathleen was first a poet and secondly an advocate of rediscovering the proper practice of the arts. She found a way, despite the lack of common cultural philosophy, to make language sing and draw our minds into the presence of the mystery. There I will finish.
Well, thank you very much, Joseph, for that wonderful talk. Without further ado, could we hand over to you, whether anything in what Joseph says has brought up things in your mind, questions that you'd like to ask?
Easy questions.
Easy questions, yes.
There's another microphone.
Yes, go.
Sorry.
Do you know whether or to what extent Kathleen herself read theology? Did she read either the medieval theologians or the more modern ones?
I think she was familiar with them. She doesn't write about them, but in discussion, we often discuss the medieval theologian mystics, and she was very familiar with them, actually. So she was more friendly with Christianity than she let on.
Thank you.
Jessica.
Hello, I really enjoyed your talk, even though I had to go out for a minute to help somebody. But I was just wondering, I think listening to you, I get the feeling that all of you belong to a family. There's a way of thinking the environment around us, the way we relate to nature, the sacred presence of nature. But and I hear that, and I think it echo. I mean, there's an echo for me there. It resonates. But I was wondering, modern life. That's not modern life. That's not materialism, and it's just that how can one fit in with modern life when we're coming from this tradition and we want to keep alive this spark, a spark that has to be nurtured, blown over so that it remains alive. For me, is this are we fighting a losing battle? And that's it.
Yes, well, what an excellent question. I'm sure we've all got the same question. I gave a little hint in doing one thing well, learning to do one. That was something I discovered when I was studying music. I had the discipline of only writing music on the stage in the most beautiful calligraphy. And that changes how your mind works. Very, very interesting, that kind of thing. So do one thing well. So the mystery is not actually lost, but we are living at a time where it's not in the common discourse. That's the difficulty. We're living in an age where some of us recognise this mystery and others simply don't. And this little conversation can happen between them. Or those who don't know it don't feel that they're lost. We who do know it feel we are lost in some way. We're sort of orphans in our time. But to me, that is a challenge that you can trace all through history. That was the challenge that Plato faced. He saw that the Greek culture was in decline, the gods were being lost, Homer was no longer understood, and so he responded to the crisis of his age. And I feel that we're all called to that task. We can dream about how lovely it would be to live in the golden age. I believe there is one coming, but it'll be after I've gone. But we're here. The tradition is we're here to work hard. That's our lot in this age. We're here to, in the Iron Age, it's the age of work. And to me, that means it's a conducive time for rediscovering what is lost. So that we can, I hope that is addressing your question in some way. So the feeling that something is missing is a sign of a task to be undertaken. In my own work, I gradually found this in my studies of natural law. I'm writing a book on natural law, beginning from ancient Egypt. And there's a whole tradition of the understanding of law and justice, which is completely and totally forgotten in our time. And yet shaped the whole of history up until, at least the 16th century. and now it's completely incomprehensible to the modern mind. And yet it's the greatest part of our tradition. So one can work to recover these things. I think that's a task that we can all undertake in some form. Does that help?
Another question from Hilary.
Thank you very much, Joseph. That was a really interesting and good exposition of Kathleen's thought. Very clear. Thank you. One of the things that I've always been puzzled by, perhaps, is how Kathleen deals with the theodicy of evil.
Deals with?
The theodicy of evil, with the presence of evil in the world. Obviously, you cannot blame all that on modernity or on the rise of the scientific or scientistic way of seeing the world that we have in the West. Suffering and death and inflicted suffering has always been with us. That's not a new invention. How do you felt she thought about that? And I don't mean just the sort of notion that it's all part of a cosmic, is that enough to say that it's all part of a cosmic cycle or cosmic nature of things? What would you say?
That's one of those hard questions I get asked many times. By those who say don't use the word God. They say no, answer that question about evil. I would be with St. Augustine here and the Platonic tradition that evil is simply the absence of good or absence of being, is a deficiency. It isn't actually a real entity. It sounds very pat to say that when you see suffering. What can I say? I suffer very badly with migraine, and I've learned over the years not to fight it, but to allow it to be, and somehow it can be there and it isn't a problem. So that's on a personal level that we're challenged, or perhaps let me put it in a slightly different way. When the recent war began, and I heard that on the news, I felt absolutely silent and quiet. My whole being just halted and would not rush off. What should I do? Am I upset by it, etc., etc. And this is, I think, the only way we can answer this kind of the question of theodicy is what are we called upon to do? We can't solve it outside, as it were. So it's what is our relation to the events that befall? That's the question, and we can respond to these very, very differently. And it may well be that there's a time to be utterly silent and leave things to be, rather than interfere. That is the right action. Doesn't really answer the question satisfactorily, I know, but it's all we can do is face it in our own way.
Any more questions? I'd have a quick one, if I may. Yeah, very, very quick one. It's to pick up a little bit on what Jessica was asking. How do we live in our age, and how Kathleen Raine conceived of working as an artist in our age? Because, as you've said before, we've lost the common language, yes, if you like, yes. Whether that common language be Christian or yes, Greek or Judeo-Christian. We've lost the community of language. Yes. And so it's almost as if each one of us is talking a private language or creating a private group, which is fair enough. Yep. We find ourselves perhaps in that. Yes. But there's obviously a need for a great community of learning and a community of the imagination. And you said yourself that Kathleen Raine didn't have a lot of time for Christianity explicitly. And so did she have an idea of, do you simply, in inverted commas, return to nature? Is our reference point in our time the natural world, for example? I don't know. How can we share this?
I think she gives multiple answers to the question. It is a return to nature. But one of the things that she repeatedly says, which I did quote, is that in the absence of the beautiful, we decrease. our souls wither. And so the reaffirmation of the beautiful is something immediate that can be done. Now, as for community, I understand that. When I studied music many years ago, there was no language. It was Schoenberg and Stockhouse and nothing. Well, you know, question was that's music at all. So a composer now has no language to join, as it were. In all past ages, there was always a form that composers could adopt and acquire. So it's a problem. I've confronted that problem, but the community we live in is the whole history of mankind. We can live there. And one of the funny little features of our time with a lot of community is I know young people live in a tiny little time span. They think 10 years ago is like thousands of years ago. So we can expand our sense of the time that we live in, and that can situate us more clearly in the possibilities of our time. We can dwell too easily on what's missing, but there are actually within what's missing, there's a call to do something creative. So in the end, it's our response to it that matters, not how terrible things are, but our response to it. There is a community to join.
Do we have time for another one, or I think Greville?
Thank you. Thank you very much for a wonderful lecture, Joseph. I simply wanted to make a suggestion. Our questioner from the back said that when she came to this gathering, she felt as if there were a family here. I think the answer is that family is always there. Those who understand these things intuitively,
Yes.
however little intellectual information they have,
Yes.
they will recognize one another. And that is the core, the nucleus of the family. And a larger family will grow from that when we're not alone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks a lot. Yes, thank you. I just wanted to say something about the issue of good and evil, because in fact I had a conversation once with Kathleen Raine. It was in Paris at her hotel, Place de l'Odéon, and I was involved in Buddhist philosophy, and she asked me a lot about it, and once she said, that's what I like in Buddhism, is that it doesn't reject evil. It's part of the whole thing. In fact, it's like the two sides of the same coin. And evil and good is the transformation of evil. And she said that that was something that Christianity didn't understand, that there was a problem with this belief, because they tended to consider that there were good people and evil people, or good things, bad things. But in fact, it's the same force, the same energy at the
Yes.
core, and then it can turn into good or it can turn
Yes.
into evil.
Yes.
It's a very Platon idea as well, I
Yes.
think. Would you agree with that?
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yes. Jessica?
Is the other one? No.
I don't know whether you've ever seen them, but there are beautiful tapestries called the Apocalypse tapestries in the city of Angers. And I can't remember the name of the artist. And he was sent to Auschwitz, came back, Angers. La tapisserie de l'Apocalypse, not the other one, the one that's more famous in the castle. And the last tapestry is the mandala. He begins with the Garden of Eden, but all of this is viewed through the prism of his experience in a concentration camp, and the idea of regeneration and survival. And the last tapestry is that of the mandala, the city of good, but around the city you still see the dragons of evil. So even when you reach the ultimate state of regeneration and good, there is still evil circling. One doesn't go without the other. Claire?
Well, yes.
Would anyone stop work? Would everyone like to ask further questions? Well, thank you very much, Joseph, for your contribution.